Welcome to the Elie Wiesel Center for the second and last lecture from Dr. Alan Rosen on the legacy of Elie Wiesel. Today's talk is entitled The Holocaust and the Privilege of Authoring the Zohar, Elie Wiesel's Portraits of Talmudic Sages. And let's give a nice thank you to Dr. Rosen.
Thanks so much. Great to be here for our second installment. And even though for right now it's the closing one of our short get-together, I hope that we'll be able to work it out, that I can return in the not-too-distant future and have the privilege of studying with you together again on some facet of Elie Wiesel's great contributions. The overall mandate that we have before us, what we have to do, is to ponder how it is that Elie Wiesel, whose vocation really is that of a witness of the Holocaust, how his writings on traditional Jewish teachings are a form of Holocaust and genocide study. And last time we did that by way of his work and life on Hasidic teachings. And today we're going to then modulate to his work and life regarding Talmudic teachings. And in a way, that's somewhat baffling because we're going in reverse chronology in terms of Jewish history. The Hasidic movement came into being really in the modern time. That some 250 years ago, which is not yesterday, but it's not ancient. While the Talmudic teachings are really from the ancient period. And so we're going in reverse chronology. But as we're going to see, we're going in the chronology that Elie Wiesel himself preceded with the teachings. First came his venture into a book on the Hasidic teachings, and then, some years later, a book on Talmudic teachings. So we're inverting the order in one way, but staying within another, guided by our teacher Elie Wiesel's own life trajectory. That makes sense? Yeah? With those reversals and non-reversals there. Okay. Second, that we recall that in another somewhat baffling way, Elie Wiesel witnessed to the Holocaust, probably the most sober, devastating event on the map of human history, unfortunately, then proceeded to title more books than any other group of books that he has, using the word celebration. 4 or 5 books, and those titles are in the French original that he first wrote in and published them. And he had schemed, he projects 2 more, so a total of 7. So celebration. And just as with the Hasidic teachings, those were entitled celebration. That so is his book on Talmud, also entitled celebration. So seemingly, the whole pantheon, if you will, of Jewish teaching is understood by Elie Wiesel and communicated to us as a celebration. So, if we were going to do justice to that, we would have a table with a banquet and wine and be able to toast in royal fashion. And indeed, this is a cornerstone of Jewish life thought, meaning there is an ongoing practice that when one finishes, particularly a folio of Talmud, and I'll say more about what that means shortly, that one makes what's called a siyum, a finishing, an ending, which is really a completion. And that is a celebration that is honored with nice food and with libation. And it truly integrates, joins study with the kind of effervescent celebration that I think Elie Wiesel is speaking of here. So while in one sense it's baffling that he should trod this road, in another he's just fully consonant with tradition. The more one learns of Jewish tradition, teachings, the more one sees how consonant, how together, how in sync is Elie Wiesel with that. And third, we left off with being launched on our study of Hasidism by your reading, those in the class on Elie Wiesel, of his first book on Hasidism entitled Souls on Fire, is the English title, while the French title is Célébration Chassidique, the celebration of Hasidism. So on the English title, he comments, let me quote here, why souls on fire? Because the souls of the Hasidic masters were on fire? Yes, but even more so because they possess the rare ability of inspiring others and giving something that is lacking today, fervor. It is said of anyone who came to see the master, Rebbe Simcha Bunim of Pshiska, master of a great Hasidic line in Poland, that his soul caught fire. And anyone who came to see him, all became souls on fire. End of quote. So this idea that the going to a master, remember in the session last time, we talked about that Elie Wiesel himself, who considers himself a chassid meaning a pious follower, in this case, a pious follower of a particular mentor, a master, whose service of God goes beyond just the letter of the law. So he himself speaks of three masters that have guided him: the Vizhnitzer Rebbe from his childhood and his grandfather's mentor, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who he came to know later in life and who provides the model for that final chapter in final section of Gates of the Forest, and was so crucial to his venturing on with whole faith in his protest. And the Ungvar Rebbe, Rabbi Menashe Klein, who was a close friend who he originally met in the concentration camp at Auschwitz, and then continued to be prominent in his life up until he passed away 3 years ago. So we hear souls on fire, each of these not only being a soul on fire, but sparking, igniting others. It wasn't enough to keep it to oneself. One had to, like when taking a match or a candle, lighting another, to do that. So we have in Elie Wiesel's essay, which I asked Professor Anderson to share with you, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son. And we have, again, a kind of semblance of this, where the one who is there at the time just before the Master Rabbi Shimon's passing, and this is on page 299 for those who want to look on or do that later, I put the words we heard on paper. The last one on his lips was formed. The last one his lips formed was life. Then he stopped. I went on writing. I thought there was more to come, but nothing came. I wanted to look, but I couldn't. I couldn't lift my head, for there was so much light that my eyes could not meet his eyes. There was so much splendor enveloping the house that no one could come near all day. So this, in the splendor, really it's talked about further in the sources that his entire house was enveloped by fire. And this guiding theme of the way that fire is hand in glove with the teaching of the essential portions and mysteries of Jewish life, as a metaphor, of course, but also at times being realized literally, to be seen. And in the story that we began with last time about the Maggid of Mezrich as a boy watching his house burn, and that his mother sobbing, and his trying to comfort her, and eventually comforting her by the loss of their lineage book, that I'll start a new lineage. You don't have to rely on the past. You can be confident in the future. So what we're then going to do today is explore the particular contribution to the Holocaust and genocide studies that can really be teased out, we can say, of Professor Wiesel's Talmudic teachings. And before, though, let me just say that it's going to be brief, of course, just so that it's condensed, stay within the confines of the class period. I want to give thanks to Professor Anderson for arranging this visit and our beautiful dinner session last night, where several students also very nicely attended. And thanks to Michael Groden, Professor Groden was here at the first session, who through the Jewish Cultural Endowment also supported my visit, and the Elie Wiesel Center, where we have the privilege of being, and its director, Professor Zank, for his and their support as well. And so we'll study then. The Talmud, as I was conveying just a few minutes ago, the Talmud, in contrast to the Hasidic tradition, which is really a modern development, is an ancient development. The Talmud is comprised of two different main sections, one called Mishnah, which means to learn, and Gemara, which also means to learn. The Mishnah is a section that came into being roughly 2,000 years ago, and it is commentary on the Torah with a particular eye toward laying out the obligations according to Jewish law that any Jew would have. And there's some 60 tractates of Mishnah, actually some more than that. And then the Talmud proper, also referred to as the Gemara, is a commentary on those laws that is made up of both legal commentary, meaning saying what is the law, what kinds of restrictions are there on the Sabbath, what kind of obligations are there on the Sabbath, but also stories, just chocked full of stories, fabulous stories, personal stories, uplifting stories, and at times stories of devastation, as we'll soon see with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son, Elazar. So the Talmud then, which came together roughly in the year 400 of the Common Era, is a compilation, and it's almost all in the form of arguments that take place on various topics. There are two Talmuds, really, one from Babylonia, which is the more commonly studied, and there's also one that's called from Jerusalem, from the land of Israel, which is less commonly studied. But it's all based on arguments about different fundamental issues in guiding Jewish life. And it moves from one master to the other, one teacher to another, one student to another, and from one topic to another, which it will stay on for a few pages, but then shift gears entirely. All of this I wanted to dramatize just a little bit within our time. And if we had more time, we would learn through some of that. But that Elie Wiesel's approach is vastly different. You would never find this in the Talmud itself, to have what he calls a portrait. A portrait. What is, let me just for a second, what's a portrait? What do you think of? What associations are there? Picture. Who are you? I'm sorry.
I'm Nick.
Nick. What's your last name, Nick?
Boomstrap.
You were here last time, yeah? Yeah. Thank you, Nick. It's a picture of? Usually a person.
A single person.
Good, okay. Picture, yeah, is that you together have brought this? Yeah, a picture of a single person that does what? Why do we want a portrait? What does a portrait give us?
Capture somebody in time, at
one point in time, so we have the person there. And of course, if you have a portrait, you are not necessarily going to be deprived of them when they leave this world. If we're talking about a picture, as Nick had said, that one sits for and that either the photographer takes a portrait or the painter, so renders it. And also usually I think a portrait is meant to not just be to get a resemblance, though that could be important too, but it tries to get at something that defines that particular person. What makes that person distinctive? What gives them their particular look and looking in a certain way? So that's what Elie Wiesel's model is. And he then goes into the 63 volumes of Talmud and he distills from it various details of a life, bringing those into one line here, one line there, drawn from one place, drawn from another place, and joins them together. So this is, I think, our beginning point of what's consequential for Elie Wiesel, Talmudic study, and the mandate that he as a Holocaust witness sees to Holocaust and genocide studies. Because he wants to make sure that the person, the individual life, is front and center. Meaning that, as we talked about with the notion of celebration, his 4 or 5 books titled Celebration, he wants, in the face of such a devastating event, where life was cheapened so radically, he wants to exalt, to bring an understanding about the preciousness, absolute, ultimate preciousness of life. In his way of doing that with the Talmud is to render a portrait. So we have an idea of what makes that life singular, precious, and holy. And second, has to do with one of the reasons why I chose the particular essay on Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son, Elazar. And if you haven't read it yet, that hopefully then in the aftermath of our session you'll read. But his exploration and his intrigue with this portrait of this person is that Rabbi Shimon was great as a Talmudic master. Many, many teachings are learned from him, over 200, which is a lot in the corpus. He's one of the greats. Whoa. I thought I did something with the line or something that I snipped it somehow. But the driving question for Elie Wiesel is connected to the fact that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is both a Talmudic master, but he also is the absolute source of the teachings of Jewish mysticism. It was he who was given the privilege of bringing forth into the world the secret teachings of Jewish mysticism. And which then are compiled in a book called the Zohar, which is contemporary, according to tradition, with the Talmud, because it issues from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So Elie Wiesel, fascinatingly, he says, what did he have to do to earn such a merit? It's not just, in other words, God, and we're speaking here, God is very much deciding everything that goes on with what comes to whom when. So saying, why should this student study this field? Why should this student study that field and have the promise to bring out insights that will help humankind in the greatest way? So with Rabbi Shimon, asking not just that what he did, but why did he earn this singular privilege? So that is the driving question. But all of this, too, is Elie Wiesel's interest here, particularly because the Talmud usually is seen as one body of teaching, the Zohar, the mystical tradition, another, legal versus mystical, what is straightforward versus what is enigmatic. But Elie Wiesel says they're really absolutely connected. and his own preoccupation with the mystical dimension that is here interfused is absolutely connected with the Holocaust also. Elie Wiesel, virtually alone in many respects, has, through his life's career, averred, put forward, stated that the Holocaust must be dealt with as a mystical event, which in no way means that the facts of the Holocaust terribly did not take place, but that to have any kind of intimation of the meaning of the Holocaust is mystical in nature. So this is so pervasive in his life that he, when asked about why did he end up choosing French, the language of French, to write about the Holocaust, and in his literary language really taking over. He could have written in Yiddish, he could have written in Hebrew. Certainly his English became superb. But he says that French, any students of French here? Any speakers of French? Okay, not yet. Tomorrow you'll go sign up, right? I want to read Elie Wiesel in the original, okay, sign me up. So French is, he says, the most rational language. What does that mean? It comes out of a tradition of French philosophy, which is rational through Descartes, called the Cartesian tradition, which wants everything to be absolutely clear. No fuzziness, nothing that's an enigma. So Elie Wiesel said he wants to take on the challenge of using the most rational language to deal with one of the most mystical of events. Amazing. So this mystical dimension that is fused also in the time of the Talmud becomes very important. And within the essay on Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that we're going to see in a minute, why this kind of preoccupation of he, as the Talmudic master, great Talmudic master that he is, why he would earn the privilege to fuse the two traditions and bring this mystical teaching in the world. Now, Elie Wiesel, just again to open that biography, Elie Wiesel studied the Talmud as a child in his primary school, and if you go to the collection Legends of Our Time and the essay called My Teachers, he'll talk about when he begins to learn the Talmud and the great adventure that becomes. And then he studied in yeshiva up until the time that the families were uprooted in 1944. Remember that Hungarian Jewry, of which Elie Wiesel grew up and was a part, was the final intact Jewry in Europe, and still so intact and so vigorously alive that it seemed unbelievable that life could be threatened. So he studied in yeshiva up to that time, learning Talmud, and even wrote commentaries on his learning at that time as a boy. But it was only later in the 1960s, after the war, when he took as a teacher a great Talmudic scholar and repository of Talmud, whose name was Shaul Lieberman, Rabbi Shaul Lieberman. And as Elie Wiesel told me about 10 days ago, he said, when I was a boy, yes, we learned Talmud, we memorized it, but it was with Rabbi Lieberman that I began to go inside of Talmud. And that gave him the confidence, we can say, to make Talmud, even though Elie Wiesel is not per se a scholar of Talmud, but he's a Jew who studies Talmud, who learns Talmud, to make those part of his lectures and his mandate in, we can say, teaching Holocaust and genocide studies. So we can find the essays in French. It's in the volume called Célébration Talmudique, but in English, the main Talmudic corpus is in his book Sages and Dreamers and Wise Men and Their Tales. And if you look on your list, we see, first of all, the two reading lists. Just remember that the Celebration Talmudique is at the bottom of the page. First came out in 1991. So that's almost 20 years after his book on Hasidism. Meaning to gain the knowledge and wherewithal to be able to bring that forth was something that took time. And then he did venture. And the essay on Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is then special in looking at the fusion between Talmud and mystical tradition, but also the mandate for Holocaust studies. And we're clued into that in the essay by its title. Titles are always consequential. One always has to pause and ponder, just like the title Celebration. Right? I mean, you have celebration, Elie Wiesel's celebration. So here, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son. So if one looks through all of Elie Wiesel's writing, there is no other father and son essay title at all. And of course, for those, how many of you have read Night? Yeah, a lot. And of course, the course is to go beyond Night, but Night is the foundation of Elie Wiesel's writing. So at the center of Night, as we know, is the relationship between father and son. So here, as we see in this special title of this essay, the father and son is there again, paramount. It's not only an individual portrait, it's a portrait of two together. It's a portrait of intergenerational transmission. It's a portrait of what they went through, like Elie Wiesel and his father went through. And this one can find explicitly on the last page of the essay, that when he talks about the son of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that he chose to accompany his father into exile. They lived during a time of Roman oppression. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai spoke out steadfastly against the Roman authorities, and this really is in consonance with Elie Wiesel's position of speaking truth to power fearlessly. And he had to run for his life, and they ended up, he and his son, hiding in a cave for some 13 years. 13 years, where they studied during that time by memory all the time. And what Elie Wiesel emphasizes is that the son was not under the same threat. He didn't have to run, but he chose to accompany the father. So then, glossing that choice, he says, I think of this son fondly because, with an ellipsis there, page 310, I recall a time when I was with my father there, in italicized, meaning in the concentration camps, away from home. We were not alone, and yet we were. And because we were alone as never before, we grew close to one another as never before. Before, I rarely saw him. He was busy in the store, the community. I saw him on Shabbat, meaning the day of rest where the store is closed and they had some time. Now, in the camps there, I saw him all the time. We could finally talk and talk. He alone mattered to me. I alone mattered to him. I was essential to his life as he was to mine. And here, then, he reads his own biography over against that of Rabbi Shimon and his son, Elazar. But unlike Rabbi Elazar and his father, I left the cave alone. As we know, his father was murdered in the camps, and he went out alone. So this means that Elie Wiesel then recruits Talmudic teachings to tell the story of the Holocaust. And when we say, why does he need to do that? Why can't he just write it straightforwardly like he did in 9? It's because he believes essentially in the vigorous transmission of the Jewish tradition as a mode of truth-telling, as a mode of bringing forth the mysteries of the world. And so that body of knowledge has already been honed, has already been primed to deal with the Holocaust. It's not as if he's forcing it to do something. It's there. And it just has waited for Elie Wiesel to show the way that it's there. And then finally with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and with other portraits that he draws of a multiplicity of masters, some 15, I believe, that he goes back to what earned him the merit of being the conduit for the mystical tradition that changed Jewish life, that changed the life of the world. It would take more time to show you exactly how, but believe me, it did. So I mentioned that Rabbi Shimon had to go into hiding. He was being pursued with a death sentence by the Romans. They went to the north of Israel. You can go there today to what's said to be the cave that they hid in. And his son went with them, went with him. And they were there for 12 years in the cave, learning, studying. They came out of the cave because they were told that the death sentence had been lifted. He was no longer being pursued. They could come out without threat to their life. So they came out of the cave and they saw that the world was simply the same. Simply the same. And they couldn't believe it. This happened. A death sentence. We're there for all this time hiding, and the world just goes on about its business. So their eyes were filled with rage and anger that their eyes emitted fire and burned up fields and even burned up the informer that told on Rabbi Shimon. And they were told then by a heavenly voice that if you're going to come out and destroy my world, by way, this is God saying, if you're going to destroy my world, if that's what you're about, go back into the cave. They went back into the cave, and then they came out again a year later. And this is on page 308. They went back for another year, quoting Professor Wiesel. And when they came out again, Rabbi Elazar was still angry, but his father was not. Whatever Rabbi Elazar's eyes wounded, Rabbi Shimon's eyes healed. And then Elie Wiesel says, this is Rabbi Shimon's greatness. And we hear then echoes of his own life, career, and vocation. Therein lay Rabbi Shimon's greatness. He had to go beyond suffering. The last year was probably the hardest in order to rediscover compassion and understanding. Had he remained angry and bitter to the end, he would have been remembered with awe, not with love, and surely not in mystical legend. The last year made a different man out of him. It was a year beyond suffering, beyond fear, beyond solitude. For suffering confers no privilege on anyone. It all depends on what one does with it. If it leads to resentment and revenge, it is doomed to remain weak and sterile. If it becomes an opening toward man, then it may turn to strength. End of quote. And this becomes then the consummate message for Elie Wiesel's teaching about Holocaust and genocide. Meaning the witnesses have a primary role, but the witnesses themselves have a standard that they have to ascend to, of which he knows how difficult it is to lose one's family through this terrible carnage and atrocity, and to be able to transcend that anger at those who did this and at the world that was silent. But it is necessary. So we've seen now that Elie Wiesel then sets out a mandate for the study of Talmud as a conduit, as a path to Holocaust and genocide education. First, by rendering a portrait, so the person, preciousness of life. Second, the mystical dimension fused with the Talmudic, with study, means exploring the mystical. And for him, the Holocaust can only be intimated in its meaning through mystical knowledge. Third, the precious relation of a father and son, meaning every human being in their portrait is a portrait not only individually, but in those they're connected to. And the Talmud becomes the honed prime tradition by which the story of the Holocaust can best be told. And finally, the ethical mandate to move beyond suffering, beyond anger, beyond rage. Thanks. And now we'll...
Thank you very much for your words and your wisdom. It definitely brings back memories of being in this room with Professor Wiesel many years ago. Does anybody have questions or comments for Dr. Rosen? I think you've moved us all to some contemplative silence here. Anybody have any questions?
First of all, no wrong
Thoughts?
questions. Can be on either the previous session, this one. It can be anything related, any ideas connected with Elie Wiesel, reading Elie Wiesel, with Hasidism, Talmudic study. I can't say that I'll be able to respond to all, but I'll try to tell you if I can't.
Anyone? Yeah, 1 minute.
So you discussed a little bit about the Holocaust as a mystical event.
Yeah.
And I don't quite understand the meaning of that. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about what that means and like the implications of that historically and spiritually.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Karen. Just briefly, I think that first, on the level, I'll deal with it here. There's other levels. But the Holocaust, how many of you, you've read 9, many of you, most of you, right? Some of you maybe have read other kinds of historical studies about the Holocaust. Yes? Some, yes, by Saul Friedlander, by Raoul Hilberg, by Dvorah Dwork, by many, many, many histories. Most of the study and writing about the Holocaust is from historians, or their memoirs that build on materials from the time, mainly that of the perpetrators, often. And they try to give us an idea of what took place, when, who did it, how, and to some degree, but not always why, in historical terms. So Elie Wiesel, I think on that level, is saying that's well and good. It's important because otherwise we know that the enemy wanted there to be no memory of the Holocaust. They wanted it obliterated, not only the people, but any memory, and that's crucial. But he's saying that's fine, but that doesn't begin to get at the meaning. Meaning, for such an event to take place that would obliterate such a number and such a complete evisceration of Jewish life in a certain place where it had existed for hundreds and hundreds of years, that God must have had a meaning to this that is not there on the surface. So once one brings God into the picture, which he always does as a believer, he says there must be a meaning that's underneath, not only an ethical meaning, and the ethical meaning challenges one to a mystical meaning that on the surface it would be that this goes against God's own purpose. Why would God want to eviscerate those who are seemingly servants of God and the Jewish people, who is the chosen people? So that's the linchpin, contra to history that says, okay, we've given all the explanations, all the descriptions that are needed. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to just add to that. I recall that Wiesel and others have talked about the Holocaust as having constituted some kind of revelation, which perhaps we don't necessarily understand. So that's typically what defines a mystical experience in some ways, is that there's something revealed which perhaps is difficult to understand. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. Excuse me, let me get the mic to you.
Our dear friend, Lori Poland, who so honored the occasion by coming, Rabbi Nehemiah Poland's wife.
Oh, wonderful.
Certainly
so nice to meet you.
A very consequential individual in her own right.
Great.
So great that you're here.
So I was just curious about the reversal of roles in what you said. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai went back into the cave with Elazar and came out and was able to heal what his son was continuing to destroy with his rage. And in contrast, Elie Wiesel was the son and tried to do the healing without his father, who did not come out of the Holocaust or the cave, quote unquote.
So Lori, you're asking what significance would that kind of reversal have for Elie Wiesel? So it's such a great question. And when you go back, please read, make sure if you read nothing else, read that page, because that's really the center point. He doesn't spell that out, interestingly, but leaves it. I think, though, just speculating, I think he's saying something about the kind of maturity that it takes to be able to ascend to a level where one is not enslaved by rage. And that it was a labor to reach a certain point, certainly to begin with a vow of 10 years of silence for him to begin to write about the Holocaust from 1945 to 1955. So that I think that he's intimating that the father here is a symbol of that kind of maturity, so that even though it was the father who was the one who was sentenced, it's he that, with that year, which he says is the hardest, was able to go to the next rung. I also talked last time, and I think it's very important, that Elie Wiesel only began to write about Jewish traditional texts in book form when same year, he became a father. And so that reversal of roles for himself seemingly was very consequential in allowing a certain retrieval of what was important to bring a traditional idiom and view to the Holocaust that wasn't there before. So those two, one maturity, the other within his own life experience of becoming a father and moving to that other role. I just want to maybe conclude with, two things. One, Erin and I had this discussion the other day where she talked after my presentation last time about the need for being outraged, I think, meaning the way in which the study of the Holocaust can be done in a way, very much just studying, especially in a university. You go from Science 101 to Holocaust 202. And yet, in order to really study, there needs to be a sense of being deeply perturbed. So Elie Wiesel talks about how when he was teaching about the Holocaust, one's mother of a student came to see him and said, you know, my daughter, she's studying, she really feels privileged, but she has nightmares every night. And he says to her in a way that this Elie Wiesel, who is so gentle and kind, says, you should be worried if she wouldn't have nightmares. Right? And I'm not saying don't try to cultivate nightmare, to read just before going to sleep in that way. But nightmare here is a symbol for having this enter one's life in a way that leaves one with, in some way, not being comfortable, not being able to just move from room to room, to class, from idea to idea, from emotion to emotion. So, then we'll end with a story that Elie Wiesel, back to Hasidic tradition, then Elie Wiesel tells several different places in the Hasidic, in the book Souls on Fire, in his other essays and also in his autobiography. So this has to do with Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi, who was the first rabbi of the stream of Hasidism called Chabad, which some of you know. There's a Chabad house down the street. He was a master some 220 years ago and was also, like Rabbi Shimon, imprisoned for his what was said to be treason. He was really collecting money for Israel and those in Israel, but because Israel was at that time under the Ottoman Empire and he was living in Russia, and Russia was antagonist with the Ottoman Empire, he was seen to be committing an act of treason, imprisoned in Petersburg, and there under a death sentence. But the warden of the prison heard that they had a holy man there in prison. And the warden of the prison was a religious Christian and interested in the Bible. And he asked if he could have a visit with this holy man, and was told, fine, yeah. Rabbi said, sure. So he came to visit. He was struck immediately by his luminous appearance. And he said, Rabbi, can I ask you a question about the Bible? I said, sure. He said, in the beginning of the Bible, it talks about Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve, they eat from the forbidden tree, the tree of knowledge, and they go running, and they hide behind a bush. And God comes looking for them, striding in the garden, and says, Ayeka. He says, where are you? So the warden says to the rabbi, what kind of question is this in the Bible? God, who knows everything, sees everything, can't see behind this bush? It's ludicrous. Absolutely ludicrous. So what does it mean? So the rabbi says to the warden, do you believe that the Bible is not only an ancient document, but is meaningful for all time? He says, yeah, sure. He says, so I'll tell you. He says, when God says to Adam and Eve, where are you? Ayeka. He says, where are you? Where are you in your life's course? You've committed this sin. You've changed the world. So now, where are you in what is your task? How will you fulfill your mission on earth now? So the rabbi looks at the warden, says, you're 47 years old now. The warden doesn't understand how he knows that. He says, you're 47 years old. Where are you with your life? Where are you in what you have been sent down to accomplish? And the warden is taken with this. Elie Wiesel begins the second volume of his autobiography with this story. And he says, after writing probably 40-some books at that period, 1997, he says this story, he doesn't just leave it out there. He says, I ask myself, where are you? Have you been spared to do what you've done? And have you accomplished that? So that's Elie Wiesel's work. It's to be able to give us the privilege of voicing that question to ourselves in a way that's not in any way immobilizing or paralyzing, but rather ennobling, because we all have a mission, and empowering. So I bless you that you in your study with Professor Anderson, your other studies here at Boston University, your life's journey, that it really finds the most optimal way to use the days granted to you, each and every one. Thanks so much.